let's get this show on the road officially here. As a clinical psychologist, mental health advocate, faculty member, and survivor of her brother Carson's suicide, Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas sees issues of suicide prevention from many perspectives. Currently, she is the CEO of the Carson J. Spencer Foundation and the Survivor Division Chair for the American Association of Suicidology. Dr. Spencer-Thomas is a professional speaker, trainer, as you'll see, presenting nationally and internationally on the topic of suicide prevention. Boy, what a topic to start the morning, right? But she has published 4 books on mental health issues, lives in Conifer, Colorado, not too far away in the beautiful mountains here, with her partner and 3 sons. Today, Dr. Spencer-Thomas will be sharing with you about mental illness. Please welcome Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas.
It's December 7th, 2004. I'm driving, perhaps a little too fast, in my Toyota RAV4, and I'm taking my kids to a party my students are hosting for the end of the year holiday celebration. Nicholas, 6 years old, Tanner's 4, and Jackson's just 3 months, and they're sitting in the back seat. Nicholas is teaching Tanner the dreidel song. I'm bringing the ham as the main dish for the party, so the whole car smells like cloves, and I got the poinsettia on the front seat. And the phone rings. It's my mother. And she says, "Our worst fears have been confirmed. Your brother has died by suicide." Now, 6 months before, my brother had been on top of the world. A successful businessman, a loving husband and father, many, many friends. He was the Pied Piper. Everybody would follow him anywhere. But my brother had an invisible disability, and that was he harbored the demons of his bipolar illness. He hid them from everybody, and they ultimately proved to be fatal. Just 1 week before his death, my brother and I sat down to have a chat. I had just read the book, The Unquiet Mind, by Dr. Kay Redfield Jamison, who in her own beautifully written memoir chronicles her own fight against bipolar illness, her almost near fatal suicide attempt, and most importantly, her recovery. And I said, "Carson, look, here's this other very accomplished public person just like you. She's gotten better. We can figure this out. There's hope. There's hope. There's hope." And he looked at me and he said, "But Sally, it's madness." And less than a week later, he was dead. Now, I don't know exactly what he was trying to tell me in that conversation, but I have a pretty good idea. He was an incredibly determined man that was bound and determined to get him through all obstacles in his life. And I believe in my heart that he would have fought to get well if he knew when he got to the other side of this long, dark night of the soul that he could have his life back, that he could have the respect and dignity that he deserved. And I believe he lost that hope. And that makes me so mad. It makes me mad that someone with a treatable health issue like bipolar illness has also not only to deal with the unbearable psychological pain that comes from that illness, but also all of this discrimination, misperception, and prejudice. On the night that Carson died, his good friend called my brother's wife and said, "Oh my God, what can I do?" And she said, "No matter what you do, don't let him be forgotten." So the seeds for the Carson J. Spencer Foundation were planted on the night of my brother's death. By January, this man had convened all of my brother's closest friends from across his lifespan and our family. And in our grief reaction, we resolved to do something. We were going to find bold, gap-filling ways to prevent what happened to Carson from happening to other people. And we were also going to do this in a way that celebrated my brother's life through innovation, vision, and entrepreneurship. Fast forward over a decade later, and we are now known as leaders in suicide prevention and in innovation. And one of the things that I'm particularly passionate about is positioning this issue as a social justice issue and as a social movement. So that's what we're going to talk about today. How do we shine the lights and illuminate the path to make this social movement a big part, the social movement of our generation? So the 3 lights that I'll share with you today. Number 1, we got to shine that light on ourselves. Each of us was brought in a culture where these same misperceptions are formed and cultivated. We got to unpack that and look at them. The next light we got to shine is, how do we illuminate hope How do we cultivate hope in people, in systems, and communities so that people can hang on when life challenges come their way? And then finally, how do we enroll and enlist a wider circle in our effort? You know, the people who usually show up for these things are people like me, people who have been bereaved by suicide. Sometimes mental health providers show up, and more recently, larger numbers of suicide attempt survivors and their families are showing up, carrying the flag. We are a determined group, we are a feisty group, we are a smart group, we are a mighty group, and we are a small group, or at least the ones that are out. So we need to enroll and enlist other leadership, other people, other voices, other energy to really create the social movement that's needed to create the change that we want. So let's start with ourselves. The very first thing we need to do is unpack those beliefs. Many of us harbor beliefs that we don't even know are getting in the way of doing this work. I'm going to throw out 3 provocative things to think about, and as I do, just do that internal self-check. Do I believe that? Do I not believe that? Why am I pushing against that? What do I really think? The first one, suicide is preventable. Suicide is preventable. There is a national movement right now called Zero Suicide. 0. That's the number we're going for, because what other number is appropriate? But you should hear the kind of pushback we get from that. 0, oh, no, 0 is not possible. How could we ever get to 0? Well, think about that. We have evidence now when large behavioral health systems, when their leadership and their practices commit to continuous improvement, going to 0, lo and behold, suicide numbers drop drastically. It's a mind shift. And when your mind shifts to it is possible, all kinds of things happen. So what if suicide were completely preventable? What would we be doing differently? So why is that provocative? Well, because a lot of families like mine did everything we had in our power, at least at the time with the tools and the science that we had, to keep our loved ones here. And to hear that suicide is preventable is really hard for us. But I like to think of it just like we do think about cancer. There's a lot we can do to prevent cancer from ever happening. We can clean up our environment, we can teach people how to eat well, we can have them never start smoking, and sometimes people are still gonna get sick. And when they get sick, we're gonna catch it early. We're gonna have all kinds of screening programs in place, and we're gonna treat it aggressively as soon as we identified it, and hopefully eliminate it before it progresses to where it's life-threatening. And sometimes we'll do all of that well, and people are still gonna get sicker, and we're not gonna stop. We're gonna continue to give them the best treatment, the best science that we have to bear. And sometimes, despite all of our efforts, we might still lose people. But we don't get all ruffled when we hear, we are gonna eradicate cancer. That is a valuable goal. That's what we're trying to achieve with suicide prevention as well. The second provocative thing I want you to think about is mental health is different from physical health. Mental health is different from physical health. Well, at some point in our collective thinking, the brain left the body. The brain is certainly a part of a body, and everything that's going on in the brain is affecting the body and vice versa. But we treat these things very differently. When I show up and I've got a broken arm or a gash in my leg, empathy and support is automatic. But when I have that same level of pain, but it's internal and you can't see it, instead of getting empathy and support, I often get judgment and prejudice. The many ways that this shows up in our healthcare systems, in our peer support, in our friends, schools, and workplaces is devastating. An added level of injury to people who are fighting for their lives. The last thing I want you to think about in terms of unpacking your beliefs is this idea that talking about suicide can put an idea in someone's head. Talking about suicide can put an idea in someone's head. Now, what I've learned about people who are harboring suicidal thoughts is it's not only the pain and the fear of holding those thoughts, but it's also the tremendous feeling of isolation that accompanies them. The fear that no one's going to understand, that they're going to be judged. So when someone reaches out and says, I've noticed, it would be understandable if you're thinking about suicide. I'm wondering if that's true for me, for you. How can I help you? That experience of connection and empathy does so much to reduce that anxiety of being alone. So reaching out and using direct language about suicide is comforting and connecting for people. That said, there are ways that we talk about suicide all the time publicly that do increase vulnerability for people who are already thinking about suicide. We're not planting suicide ideas in their head, but when we talk about suicide in ways that glamorize it or romanticize it, or we talk too much about means or places or death scenes or whatever, sometimes people over-identify with that story and they become more at risk themselves. So the second thing that we need to do is really increase our knowledge. We need to increase our knowledge and our skills on how to have these conversations with people in our lives, our classmates, our coworkers, our teammates, our neighbors. We need to understand that people are much more likely to die by suicide than motor vehicle accidents, than breast cancer. We need to bring out these issues like we do other health issues and raise them up as priorities in our communities. It's not just about awareness. I mean, we knew for decades that smoking was bad for us before we did anything to change. We need to move hearts, we need to change policies, and we need to develop skills that give people the tools to really change this. All right, that's light number one, starting with self. Then we gotta shine that light out, and we gotta figure out how to cultivate hope, because hope really is the antidote to suicide. You can think about your own life challenges, and if you had a glimmer of hope on the periphery, you are much more likely to persist than if you were standing in a dark room with no way out. So there's this model developed by an international thought leader named Dr. Thomas Joyner, who wrote the book, Why People Die by Suicide. And he looked at all the warning signs and risk factors associated with suicide, and there were hundreds of them. And he boiled them down to these three common pathways. I'm gonna highlight two, because they really inform hope. One is about perceived burdensomeness. People who are suicidal often feel like they become a burden to the people who love them. Their thought process is this: my death is worth more to the people who love me than my life is. Now, this turns conventional wisdom on its head, right? People always say, such a selfish act, suicide. Not to the people who are suicidal. In their minds, they believe they're doing everybody a favor. It's a selfless act. They believe that everybody's going to be better off if they're not here. And you can think about the many ways that people come to think that they're a burden, whether it's an illness or a financial problem, or they've done something that's humiliating, they've made a mistake, they've failed, there's been a divorce. The word perceived is important because when people are in the throes of a mental health condition like depression, very often their world comes down to a very narrow tunnel. And the ability to generate solutions and problems and see themselves from an objective standpoint is compromised. But this is their reality, perceived burdensomeness. The second part is what he called thwarted belongingness. We are hardwired to be in relationship with other people. And when those inner circle folks are taken away from us through death, moving, getting kicked out of school, losing a job, incarceration, separation, it also increases suicide thoughts. So if these are some of the drivers for suicidal despair, then the opposite is protection. So instead of burdensomeness, we have purpose. Instead of isolation, we have belonging. So when we cultivate hope in our communities, especially our communities that have increased vulnerability, let's think about how to renew a sense of purpose and how to have genuine connection. The last light that we need to shine needs to be that beacon to bring people into the movement. Now, in 2001, my father was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And when he told me, he whispered it, I have cancer. Now, my father was brought up in an era where cancer was understood as something you brought upon yourself, some kind of moral failing, something that you did, and it was a death sentence. So my father had tremendous amounts of fear, shame, and hopelessness around his diagnosis. I was brought up in an era where you kicked cancer's butt. You caught it early, you did everything in your power, and there were tons and tons of stories of successful recovery. Also in 2001, I had given birth to my second child, Tanner, and I had put on some weight from the pregnancy that I was interested in getting rid of. And someone suggested to me, there's this 3-day walk for breast cancer. Why don't we train for it? And I thought, yeah, that'll get me back in shape. Let's do that. I had no connection to breast cancer. I had no one close to me that had been affected. I signed up for this walk because I wanted to get in shape. And I showed up for this incredible 60-mile, 3-day trek from CSU, Colorado State University, to CU Boulder. And I showed up at the start line, and there were 3,000, mostly women, walking alongside me. Many of them had handkerchiefs on their head from recovering from chemo. Countless people carrying balloons of butterflies and stars and hearts, honoring their loved ones. And when I look back at those experiences, now that I'm in the throes of the suicide prevention movement, I think there's a lot we can learn from the breast cancer movement. They got a lot of things right. We can stand in solidarity with people who are fighting for their lives and say, I will walk with you. And we can lift up the people who have passed and honor them with dignity and respect. And we can say the words loudly, directly, and deal with it. So it's important to engage this wider circle. And the way that we can do that is through organized empowerment. Now, these pictures below, I am thrilled to say, were just taken a couple months ago at the Washington, D.C. Monument Mall. Hundreds of us gathered to march in solidarity to demand dignity for people who are struggling and challenged by mental health conditions. And it's really important that we come together and lift up the voices who have lived experience with these issues, lived experience with recovery, lived experience with the barriers and challenges that people face every day when they fight for their lives. These people have often been rendered voiceless, pushed to the sides, marginalized, discriminated against, and yet they hold the key. It's the black box of how to understand how to recover from this. And when we lift up these voices, magic starts to happen. People see hope. They see promise that recovery is possible. We also need to enroll these stakeholders, business leaders, faith community leaders, educational leaders, to not only take this on as a priority that they're championing, but also to raise their hand and say, me too, me too. My life has been affected by these issues, and I am with you, and I will fight along with you. It's been really exciting. We've been working quite a bit with the Denver Fire Department, who came to acknowledge, like in the national landscape, that they'd had more firefighters die by suicide than line-of-duty deaths. This has been a fact we've known for a long time, but recently, the first responder community has taken attention to this. And when I went to start partnering with them, I said, who's out? Who's talking about recovery? And I don't really care from what. Who is sharing stories of hope that you can get through this? And they said, nobody. Why would anybody do that? We depend on each other's lives to be mentally resilient. And I said, well, sadly, until people see that story, nobody's going to believe it's possible. It took them 1.5 years to develop the courage. These men and women run into burning buildings, to develop the courage to come out with their stories. And when they did, all the way from the chief to the assistant chief, captains, lieutenants, and firefighters, it changed the landscape. It provided permission for people to say, me too. So how do we act against this injustice? How do we lift these voices and create social change? All right, I want to have some help in bringing down the lights. And as I do that, grab the flashlights that are on your table. And if you don't have the flashlights, what I want you to do is pull out your phones. We're going to use those as lights. And everybody's going to bring the house lights to completely dark. Can I get that door shut in the back, please? And we're going to pull these lights down. Go ahead. All the way down. Dark, 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 dark. Okay. So I experienced my own depression in the spring of 2012. I had a perfect storm of life events happening. I was vulnerable in a number of ways, and I was just brought to my knees. And the experience of the depression that I had felt like this, being in this dark room, there's no way out, there's no hope on the horizon, and feeling terribly isolated and alone. And this is the common experience that I also hear from people who are suicide attempt survivors. Now, I'm going to ask you to light your lights, whether it's the flashlight or the phone, in response to some prompts that I'm going to give you. And when I do, go ahead and lift them up. All right? So my first prompt is, if you are a suicide loss survivor, go ahead and raise your lights. If you've lost someone you love to suicide, whether it's a friend, family member, coworker, classmate, teammate, neighbor, thank you. Hold them up. You are all shining lights of hope, because when the fanfare goes away and the resources dry up, we are all there carrying the flag forward, making meaning out of our loss and saying, not one more life to lose. Thank you. Put your lights down. If you, yourself or with someone you love, have ever walked through that long, dark night of the soul of being depressed, anxious, experiencing trauma, lift your lights up. Anytime feeling overwhelmed, suicidal, scared, huge life challenges, thank you. You are all shining lights of hope. Keep them up. Thank you. Because when others are in that place of despair, you can walk alongside them and you can say, I don't know exactly what you're going through, but maybe I've experienced something similar, and I have some ideas and I'm with you, and I will walk with you. Okay, go ahead and put your lights down. Now, if you are supporting the mental health promotion movement and the suicide prevention movement for any reason at all, go ahead and lift your lights up. Every light should be up. Okay, very good. Raise them proudly. Now imagine you are that person in that dark room, feeling isolated, alone, and afraid. And you look up and you see all of these lights around you. I am with you. I will not leave you. I have some ideas. We'll get through this together. You provide the hope. Okay, thank you. Lights back up. So in closing, I just want to say thank you all for being shining lights of hope. You are the beacons to this movement. Your light shines brightly so that others can see and be illuminated into their own misperceptions. So thank you so much for being part of it.